Welcome in, everybody, to this deep dive into what's going on in global politics right now.
Right.
It is a crazy time to be alive.
Yeah.
But today we're going to be focusing on the fall of the Assad regime in Syria
Right.
and what that means for Russia.
Okay.
I have with me some really fascinating sources.
Okay.
One is a scholarly article about Russia's strategy in Syria. And then the other is a really interesting CNN segment that I found with all these foreign policy experts.
Cool.
So we're going to try to weave this all together.
Yeah.
But really the mission here is to see if the fall of the Assad regime, which was, Russia's longstanding ally, if that signals that Russia is, kind of declining as a global power.
Yeah.
So let's jump in.
Interesting.
What are your initial thoughts?
I think it's interesting.
Okay.
When you look at the Assad regime falling, it's a surprise to a lot of folks.
Right.
Just how quickly it happened.
Yeah.
And I think that actually reveals some things.
Okay.
About maybe underlying weaknesses.
Okay.
That were overlooked.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was reading about that. I mean, it seems like they had a lot of internal factors that were kind of making them fragile anyway.
Yeah, and Russia's support might have papered over those.
Totally.
For all these years.
Like they didn't have to face their own issues because Russia was there to prop them up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now
the weaknesses are exposed.
Yeah, it really makes you rethink this whole perception of Russia as this unyielding, global power.
Exactly.
Because they spent decades pouring resources into Syria.
Yeah.
I mean, it was their
foothold in the Middle East.
Right, their stronghold.
Exactly.
So to lose that, it seems like a pretty significant blow.
Absolutely. And it could be part of a larger pattern.
Okay.
We're seeing some things that suggest Russia might be losing influence in other areas as well.
Okay, like what?
Their relationship with Armenia is increasingly strained.
Okay.
And even in Africa, they're facing pressure to maintain their presence.
Wow. So the loss of Syria could be...
It could be.
Like a domino effect.
Yeah.
Yeah. Weakening their position.
Weakening their position across the board, globally.
Yeah.
I don't know. It reminds me of all the times that, historically, the West has misjudged how strong their adversaries actually are.
Right.
Like, think about the Soviet Union.
Right. Or
Saddam Hussein.
Yeah, exactly.
Like,
we overestimated their strength.
Yeah, we thought they were way more powerful than they turned out to be.
Exactly.
So, do you think maybe we're falling into that trap again with Russia?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question.
Right.
Because, they project this image of power.
Yeah.
But underneath it all,
there
could be these vulnerabilities. It's like the Soviet Union back in the 70s.
Yeah.
Remember that?
Yeah.
Remember
they had to seek
military support from North Korea?
Right?
Can you imagine that?
I know, it's wild. It's like they're dealing with such severe labor shortages that they actually need North Korea's help with their military.
It's pretty striking.
It is.
And then you look at, their performance in Ukraine.
Okay.
I mean, that paints a pretty stark picture, too.
In what way?
Well, they're losing a lot of equipment.
Okay.
I mean, a lot.
Like what kind of numbers?
Reports say they're losing like 320 tanks. Artillery pieces.
Like a month.
Yeah. Every month.
That's a lot.
And their production can keep up. Really? Yeah. They're only producing a fraction of what they're losing.
So like...
Same with their infantry fighting vehicles, too.
Wow. So they're just constantly...
They're hemorrhaging equipment.
Right.
Basically.
That's got to impact their ability to project power.
Yeah. Their ability to sustain a prolonged conflict.
Exactly.
And it's not just the equipment.
Okay.
They're also having trouble attracting recruits.
Oh, really?
Yeah. They're having to offer these huge signing bonuses and salaries.
How much are we talking?
Well, they're exceeding the average Russian income now.
Oh, wow.
Actually, they're paying their soldiers more per month than privates in the U.S. Army.
Wow. That's crazy.
That's great.
That's mind-blowing.
Yeah.
It really shows you how much strain this whole thing is putting on them.
Right.
I mean, and then on top of that, you think about their wartime economy.
Right.
Like, I was reading that almost half
45% of their federal budget?
45%?
Yeah. Is going to defense spending.
To defense spending. And that's not even including the money for like national security and classified projects.
Yeah. Yeah.
And on top of all that, their main revenue sources are taking a hit too.
In what way?
Well, Gazprom.
Okay.
Their natural gas giant.
Right.
They reported a big loss.
Oh, really?
This year.
That's significant.
Yeah, their first loss.
Wow.
In over 20 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it's like all these things combined.
It's painting a picture of a country that's really struggling to keep up appearances.
Like the facade is crumbling. Like that.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah.
So how do you think all this perceived weakening of Russia is affecting their political calculations?
Oh, I think it's a major factor in how they're making decisions, both domestically and internationally.
It's like they don't have as much leverage as they used to.
Exactly.
It's interesting. I was reading that even Donald Trump has weighed in on this.
Okay.
He actually called out Russia's weakened state. Wow. And he basically urged Putin to make moves towards peace in Ukraine.
Interesting.
Like he's putting the responsibility squarely on Russia, which is kind of different from some of his previous...
A departure from his previous stance?
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah. So I don't know. There's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
But I think the main takeaway
is that the fall of the Assad regime might be revealing these cracks.
These underlying cracks.
Yeah, in Russia's armor that we didn't really see before.
That we didn't fully appreciate.
So now the big question is what happens to Syria?
What happens now?
I mean, it seems like things could get even more unstable.
Yeah, the potential for instability is huge. I mean, historically...
Yeah.
When a strongman leader like Assad falls, there's often a power vacuum.
Right.
And that vacuum can be really dangerous.
Yeah, because then everyone rushes in to fill it.
Exactly.
And it's not like there's just one group waiting in the wings.
The CNN experts were really emphasizing this.
Yes, they were talking about all the different factions. You've got ISIS remnants.
Yeah.
Kurdish forces.
Turkish forces.
What's left of the Syrian army.
Right.
And of course the Russians are still there.
And they're all vying for control.
Exactly.
In a country that's already been devastated by a 13-year civil war.
A 13-year civil war.
Yeah.
It's a volatile mix.
It is.
And then you layer on top of that the challenge of actually rebuilding a functioning country.
Right, because you can't just
snap your fingers.
Not like you remove Assad and suddenly everyone...
It's going to take a lot. It's a long-term challenge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I think the CNN experts, they had contrasting viewpoints on this.
Okay.
One was like, this is just going to be...
This is going to be chaos.
Total chaos. But the other one had a little bit of optimism.
Optimism?
Yeah. They were like, the Syrian people.
Yeah.
They've already been through so much. Yeah. They've already navigated
a horrific civil war.
So maybe they're more equipped than we think.
Maybe they're better equipped.
To find some kind of stability.
To navigate towards stability.
Yes.
It's an interesting point. Yeah. It's a glimmer of hope.
It is a glimmer of hope.
Yeah.
So I think the big takeaway here is that Russia's power might be more fragile than we realize.
More fragile than we think.
And now with all this complexity in Syria and this potential for even more instability, I think the big question is what role, if any, should the international community play? Should they try to shape the future of Syria?
Or is that just going to make things worse?
Going to backfire? It's a tough question.
It is.
And it is a question.
And I think it's one that we need to
grapple with.
Yeah, we need to grapple with.
Yeah.
So that's something I want you to think about as we move forward. Okay. And I want you to keep exploring this topic on your own.
Okay.
I think that's all the time we have for today.
All right.
But we'll be back soon to dive even deeper.
Okay. Yeah. I'm looking forward to it.
All right. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll see you next time.
See you next time. Okay, so we left off talking about all these different groups vying for power in Syria.
Yeah. It's a messy situation.
It is, yeah.
So let's try to break it down a bit.
Okay, sounds good.
Like, who are the major players now?
Well, first you've got the Kurdish forces.
Right.
They've been a key force fighting against ISIS.
For sure.
but they're also facing a lot of pressure.
Especially from Turkey.
Right, exactly. Turkey sees them as a threat.
Yeah, because of that whole, like a side conflict.
It's like a conflict within a conflict.
And Turkey being part of NATO adds another layer.
Yeah, has implications to this whole thing.
For the whole geopolitical landscape.
Then you've got...
Yeah, then you've got what's left of the Syrian army.
Right.
I mean, they've been
decimated.
Significantly weakened.
Yeah.
By all these years of fighting.
And who even knows?
And their loyalties.
Where their loyalties lie now.
Are probably fractured at this point.
Yeah, it's unclear how much power they really have.
Yeah.
Will they even try?
Yeah. Will they try to regroup?
Or will they just kind of...
Or will they be absorbed into other factions?
Into other groups.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a big question.
And then, of course, there's the Russians.
Right, the Russians are still there.
I mean, they still have...
Yeah, they have a military presence.
A base.
Yeah, mainly through their naval base.
Right.
Yeah.
So how much influence
how much
do you think they can actually exert now?
Influence will they actually is gone be able to exert?
Yeah, that's
the million-dollar question.
I mean, I doubt they're just gonna
I don't think they'll just pack up
and leave.
They've
invested too much.
They've invested way too much
in Syria.
Yeah.
So they'll be looking for ways.
Right. They'll be looking to protect their interests.
So maintain some leverage.
And maintain some leverage.
Yeah, even if
through
different channels.
It's like,
yeah.
Think of it like
they've lost a key piece.
A chess game.
In this chess game.
They've lost a key piece.
Right.
But they're still in the game.
And they're still strategizing.
They're strategizing their next move.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
It reminds me of
how they've been operating in Ukraine.
Right.
Like, I mean, turning to North Korea.
Yeah, I mean, that shows a certain level.
Yeah, that's kind of
desperate.
Yeah.
But it also shows an ability to adapt, to think outside the box.
So could we see them doing something similar in Syria?
It's definitely possible. They might try to forge alliances
with unexpected players.
With some unusual suspects.
Yeah.
And speaking of unusual suspects, we can't forget about ISIS.
Oh, yeah. That's a whole other layer to this.
And largely defeated.
But they're still out there.
With all this instability.
And a destabilized Syria.
Right. Could be.
A breeding ground.
An opening to regroup.
But them to come back.
Yeah.
It's almost like.
And it's not just ISIS.
Yeah.
Other extremist groups.
Could exploit this situation too.
So it's a very,
it's a very
volatile situation.
Yeah.
And the potential for things to get worse.
Yeah.
Is very real.
So where does this leave?
Yeah, so where does this leave?
The Syrian people.
The Syrian people.
I mean, what are their prospects?
Yeah, what does the future hold for them?
And stability.
It's hard to say. I mean, they've
suffered
endured so much suffering.
Yeah.
So the road ahead is going to be really challenging.
Rebuilding a country.
Rebuilding a functioning state. From all this chaos.
From this chaos.
Yeah. It's a monumental task.
It is.
And it's going to require a lot of support.
From the international community.
Yeah. You know, the CNN experts were debating this. One was really pessimistic. They basically said,
they were like,
this is going to be total chaos. This is going to descend into utter chaos.
Yeah, utter chaos.
Yeah.
But the other expert had a more optimistic view.
They were cautiously optimistic.
Yeah.
They argued that
the Syrian people, having already survived a horrific civil war, might actually be
they might be better equipped.
Better equipped than we think.
To find some kind of stability.
To forge a path towards stability.
It's interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting to see those
meal of hope.
Those two contrasting viewpoints.
Yeah. It is.
But even if
they
avoid total chaos,
they manage to avoid complete chaos.
The question
remains.
What kind of Syria will emerge from this?
Will it be a more democratic and inclusive society?
Uninclusive.
Or will it just become
another form
of
authoritarian rule?
Right.
It's a big question.
It's not guaranteed that just because Assad is gone,
not a guarantee
that things will automatically get better.
It's for a better future.
Yeah. And it brings us to
this question of
the international community.
Should
they intervene?
Yeah, should they intervene more directly?
Or is that just gonna... Or will that just add fuel to the fire?
It's a tough call.
It's a tough question.
I don't know.
There's always a risk.
Yeah, there's always the risk.
The intervention could backfire.
That it could backfire?
Yeah, and lead to...
an unintended consequence.
But on the other hand, doing nothing.
But on the other hand...
doing nothing.
Could also have terrible consequences.
Could also have
devastating consequences.
It's a real dilemma.
It's a real ethical dilemma.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not just about Syria.
Right. And it's not just CAFT.
We have to think about
what happens inside Syria.
The wider implication. The wider implication. Region in the world.
What happens if if Syria becomes
a failed state?
A failed state.
What are the ripple effects?
Yeah, what are they?
I mean, one of the biggest concerns.
Well, I think one of the biggest concerns is that it can become a haven for terrorist groups.
A destabilized Syria could be a perfect place.
Imagine a scenario where extremist groups use Syria as a base to launch attacks on Europe or the United States.
Yeah. It's a scary thought.
Chilling thought.
Yeah. And then there's the refugee crisis.
You've got the refugee crisis.
Millions of Syrians.
Right. Millions of Syrians.
Have already fled.
Have already fled their homes.
Their homes.
Yeah.
And if things get worse.
And if things destabilize further.
It's likely to trigger.
It could trigger
another wave.
Another wave of refugees.
Refugees, which would put
enormous strain on neighboring countries.
On neighboring countries.
Like on the global
humanitarian system.
Humanitarian system.
Yeah.
And then on top of that.
Right. And on top of that.
There's the economic fallout.
You've got the economic fallout.
I mean, a protracted conflict in Syria.
Could
disrupt trade routes. Destabilize energy markets.
Destabilize energy markets, yeah.
And it could hinder economic growth in the whole region.
Instability. Instability breeds instability.
Just breeds more instability.
Yeah.
And then what about
geopolitical
implications?
Geopolitical implications.
Like,
could this power vacuum?
Right. Could a power vacuum
in Syria
lead to
the scramble for influence?
The scramble for influence among regional powers.
All these regional powers.
Like Iran. Turkey, Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
I mean, these countries have already been involved in the Syrian conflict for years.
Yeah.
They've been supporting different factions.
With Assad gone.
So with Assad out of the picture,
they might see an opportunity.
I might see an opportunity to exert even more influence.
And
that could lead to a more fractured Middle East.
Could this lead to a more fractured Middle East?
Increased rivalry.
With more rivalry.
And having potential conflicts.
A direct conflict.
Between these regional powers.
I don't know. This is a lot to digest.
It is a risk.
It's a very...
And it's important to remember...
volatile situation.
That these regional rivalries...
There's a potential.
Often have global implications.
Under widespread instability.
They can potentially draw in major powers.
And even wider geopolitical conflict. It's kind of overwhelming.
It's a lot to unpack.
Where do we even begin to untangle all of this?
Well, I think the key is to understand
the historical context.
The historical context.
Yeah.
I mean,
the Syrian Civil War.
The Syrian Civil War
didn't just
erupt out of nowhere.
Out of nowhere.
Yeah, it has roots in decades of political oppression.
These deep
social inequality
issues
and external interference.
Yeah. So
to really grasp what's happening now.
We need to go back and understand
how Syria got to this point.
Okay, let's do that. Let's rewind the clock.
And
explore the events that led to this pivotal
moment.
In Syria's history.
All
right, so we're going back in time a little bit to understand what led up to this point.
Right, going back to 2011.
Okay.
The Arab Spring.
Yeah, the Arab Spring.
That was a pivotal moment.
A lot of upheaval.
Yeah, widespread uprisings across the Arab world.
Yeah, people were demanding.
Yeah, fueled by
more freedom, more democracy.
Frustration with authoritarian rule.
Yeah.
Economic inequality.
Right.
Political repression.
And Syria.
Yeah, and Syria was...
under the Assad regime.
Right in the thick of it.
There's no exception.
I mean, the Assad family...
Right, they had been in power...
had ruled Syria...
for decades.
Yeah. With an iron fist.
Yeah, it was...
So when those protests broke out...
a very oppressive regime.
In Syria...
yeah.
Demanding democratic reforms...
the
regime cracked down hard. They responded with brutal force.
And that's really...
And that sparked this whole
conflict,
this bloody conflict
that
spiraled into
a full-blown civil war.
A full-blown civil war.
And it's hard to believe.
It's incredible.
This war has been going on for over 13 years.
That it's been raging for over 13 years.
It's not like it was
And it wasn't just an internal conflict either.
It wasn't just an internal thing. You had all these
external powers
that got involved and made things even more complicated.
So who are the main players?
Well, on one side you had Russia and Iran.
Right. Russia and Iran.
Staunch allies.
Staunch allies of Assad.
Of the Assad regime.
They were providing... There's a lot of military and financial support.
And then on the other side...
you had the United States.
Right. The United States.
Turkey. And some Gulf states.
Right.
Backing various rebel groups.
What it became...
So it essentially became...
This proxy war?
A proxy war.
With each side
kind of
supporting their chosen factions.
Pursuing their own
agendas.
Yeah.
It was a real mess.
And then you had...
You also had the Kurds.
The Kurdish forces.
In northern Syria.
Right, northern Syria.
They were kind of
carving out their
own semi-autonomous region.
Little area.
During the fighting. They became a major player.
In fighting ISIS.
In the fight against ISIS.
But their aspirations...
for
more autonomy.
Have kind of put them at odds with Turkey.
Who
sees them as a threat.
Which... views them as a threat.
So it's just...
Yeah. So you've got all of the
incredibly complex
internal and external actors.
Both internal and external.
All with their own
motivations.
Motivations and goals.
And it's made this...
It's one of the most intractable conflicts
in recent history.
And now with Assad gone.
Right. Now with Assad gone, it feels like
everything
pieces on the chessboard have been completely scrambled.
Yeah. It's a whole
new ball game.
It brings us back to our discussion
we were talking
about potential scenarios
for
Syria's future.
And one of the possibilities.
Right.
And it's a scary one.
One possibility is that
the further descends
into chaos and fragmentation.
Yeah.
Think back to...
We were talking about...
what we discussed about Yugoslavia.
Yeah.
The breakup of Yugoslavia in the 1990s. Intense ethnic conflict.
All that ethnic conflict.
And a fractured state.
And
you're saying that Syria...
Right, and Syria, like Yugoslavia, has a history of internal divisions and tensions and...
The collapse.
The collapse of a strong central authority. Like we're seeing now.
With Assad gone.
This
can create a power vacuum.
That
allows those divisions
just
erupt into violence. Yeah, so we could see different groups.
We could see a scenario where
carving out their own territory,
ethnic or religious groups,
and just
carve out their own territory
and fight for control. Which is
it's a bleak outlook. A pretty bleak outlook.
But it's happened before.
It's a scary thought.
And it really highlights the challenges of rebuilding a country. After such a devastating conflict.
After something like this.
And then there's the question of...
And then you've got...
external actors?
All the external actors.
Will they continue to fuel the conflict?
Or are they going to keep...
Or could they actually...
Or are they actually going to try...
a constructive role...
to help...
in promoting stability?
It's almost like...
Well, that depends.
It depends
on their willingness to put aside their own interests.
Their narrow interests.
And actually work together.
For a common goal.
I don't know.
It would require...
It takes like
a concerted effort by the international community.
It would require a lot of cooperation.
Supporting the rebuilding of infrastructure.
And providing humanitarian assistance.
Which seems to...
And facilitating a political process. That includes... It's hard to imagine.
All segments of Syrian society.
All those countries coming together.
Yeah.
Given all the animosity.
It's incredibly difficult, especially given the level of mistrust and animosity between the different players.
But the alternative
is crucial.
It's pretty scary.
The stakes are simply too high.
Yeah.
I mean, the alternative is...
like a failed state.
A breeding ground.
A breeding ground
for terrorism. And a source of instability that could
spill over
into neighboring countries and beyond.
It's a tough situation.
So we've talked about the potential for chaos.
We've talked about chaos.
Are there any other scenarios
that could play out?
That could play out.
Another possibility, though not necessarily a positive one, is the emergence of a new authoritarian regime. Imagine a scenario where
Assad's gone.
One of the existing factions. Or even a new group
that someone else
manages to consolidate power and establish a new dictatorship.
Just
So Assad is gone.
The same system.
But the system of oppression and repression
remains.
Yeah. It's a bleak prospect.
Not a very hopeful thought.
For the Syrian people who've already suffered so much.
After everything they've been through.
And, this new regime.
It's like out of the frying pan.
Even more brutal than Assad's, especially if it lacks legitimacy.
Your revolution.
And has to rely on force.
To maintain control.
Another form of tyranny. It's a scary thought.
It is.
But a realistic one.
Yeah.
History is full of
examples.
Of that happening.
But let's try to think a little more positively.
Well, more positively for a minute.
We've been focusing on the negative possibilities.
We've been focusing on the doom and gloom.
Which are important to acknowledge.
Right.
But are there any reasons?
For optimism.
Like,
is there any hope?
Well, one potential bright spot.
For Syria.
Is the resilience. Of the Syrian people themselves.
That one CNN expert
who's endured
unimaginable hardship and loss.
The resilience of the Syrian people.
Yet they continue to strive.
They've been through so much.
For a better future.
That they might be.
Remember that CNN expert?
Who equipped them, we think, to navigate.
For Doji, about their ability.
All of this.
To forge a path.
To find a path forward.
Towards stability.
Yeah.
That shouldn't be underestimated. The Syrian people.
That's a really powerful thought.
Have shown incredible strength and determination.
You could find a way.
If they could find a way.
To come together.
And work towards a shared vision. For their country.
And it kind of goes back to that idea.
It could offer a glimmer of hope.
That we were talking about earlier.
And it reinforces the idea.
That we can't just
that we can't simply impose
solution
from outside any lasting peace and stability in Syria.
Yeah, it has to come from
within.
Syrian people themselves.
From the Syrian people themselves.
But the international community.
But the international community can play a crucial role.
Create an environment.
In supporting that process.
That's conducive to that.
By providing humanitarian aid.
Providing aid.
Promoting dialogue.
Work
between different factions.
And helping to rebuild. Rebuild infrastructure.
Work in hell.
Those are all things.
These are all things.
They can make a real difference.
So
it's not about
dictating
solutions. It's about
creating an environment
with the Syrian people.
These Syrian people
who can chart their own course. Yeah.
And even if it's a long
and difficult road.
It's
a journey.
We're
supporting.
supporting.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
I agree.
We've covered a lot of ground.
The stakes are incredibly high.
The fall of Assad.
Not just for Syria.
The power vacuum.
But for the entire region and the world.
The potential for chaos.
A stable and prosperous Syria.
The role of external actors.
Would be.
The resilience of the Syrian people.
A victory for everyone.
It's a complex situation.
Well said.
And it's constantly evolving.
I think that's
But I think one thing
that... perfect note to end on.
Is clear.
This is a story.
The choices.
That's still being written.
That are made in the coming months and years.
And we all.
Are going to have a profound impact.
On the future of Syria.
And shaping the outcome.
And the wider world.
Stay informed.
So I hope this deep dive
has given you
a deeper understanding.
Less tough questions.
Of the complexity.
Thanks for having me.
Of what's happening in Syria.
It's been a pleasure.
And the challenges ahead.
To be a part of this conversation.
And to our listeners out there.
And to the listener.
I want to thank you for joining us.
I hope this has given you.
Stay informed, stay engaged.
A deeper understanding. And keep asking those tough questions.
Of the complexities of the situation in Syria.
We'll see you next time.
And the challenges that lie ahead.